giving her talk titled, Open to What Can Be, please give a Wabash welcome to Lieutenant General Michelle Johnson.
Thank you. Wow. Wow. Thank you, guys. Amazing. Wow, good morning, Wabash. This is awesome, and to the men of the college, to the community of Wabash, it's been such a privilege to spend these days with you. It's just an honor, and it's really a great vibe. There's a little chapel at the Air Force Academy. You've probably seen the big aluminum one, and there are 5 different religions served there, and it's all about pluralism and inclusiveness, and you've achieved that in a different way here. And for many, many reasons that I'll talk about, it really is, you've made me feel like I'm at home. So I'm just so grateful for you today and for being here with you. The Sphinx Club, thank you so much for your welcome for me, Jacob, and for your spirit. Congratulations to the soccer team. I got to see you win yesterday. Well done. Way to go. There you go. See, they didn't tell me the cool finger snapping thing, so now I'm in. But your generosity of spirit, the positive vibe, the shared purpose in your success is just something that's been a privilege to be part of today. And I know what a great tradition this is, and I've tried to do my research before I came in and watched several YouTube videos to get up to speed. The camera was on the other side on the other ones, but I was tracking. And I watched President Hess in a few of his, and it really helped me have the foundation of the trajectory of the institution organizationally. It was very moving. I'm grateful that I'm not following immediately Jim Amadon, because he's a tough act to follow, and his presentations are so moving and so insightful and profound, and I know that you see that too. And there's another one that was incredibly moving from Kim King of 99 in the spring, and I found it particularly moving, and so I want to follow up on that a little bit later on Kim's comments. But first, I thought I should give you some sense of why am I here? You know, why did President Hess let me invade your wonderful, beautiful space? And I just had the privilege of being at the Harvard Seminar for New College Presidents with Greg Hess in 2013. And then there were 50 new college presidents. 20 of them, 2 years later in 2015, met together in Dublin because one of the members of the class is the president of St. Patrick's College in Dublin, and they teach the teachers in Ireland. They have a centralized system there. And so our families came. I got to meet Laura, get to know Laura a little bit better. I had a chance to go with my family, my husband, and my twin sons, who are 14 years old and just starting high school now. So our miracles came late. You can do the math as we go along. But it's a real privilege to be with them. And then more recently at the Aspen Forum on higher education, where I presented along with the superintendent of the Naval Academy with all my bling and attire. But I'm retiring from the Air Force now, and I've left my post as superintendent just a month ago. So I'm in transition right now, but would love to continue to serve in higher education for many reasons, personal and professional. Higher education changed the arc of my life, and I would love in the next chapter of my life to be able to help, continue to change the arcs of other young people's lives and lift you to places you didn't expect to go. So President Hess has become an incredible mentor of mine, and in terms of lifetime learning, I hope that we can be an example of the fact that your education won't be finished when you graduate, guys, sorry to say. But actually, it's a really exciting prospect to spend your life learning and to be able to then give to others that way. And then to have colleagues be such great and generous mentors has just really been a privilege for me. As a superintendent of the academy, and again, maybe you're not picturing the whole general thing. I don't always look like the stereotype, maybe I do. But really, you're president of a college, 4,000 cadets, it's undergraduate, 27 majors, but everyone gets a Bachelor of Science degree because the core curriculum is so demanding. It's 2/3 of the overall requirement, so 101 semester hours core that everybody does, and it's half STEM, but it's half liberal arts. And so that's why Jacob kindly sort of adjusted the language. I don't take credit for the composition of the curriculum. Obviously, there are faculty leads in that realm, but the thing about liberal arts is that it really is about leadership, and I think people they think that's counterintuitive, that STEM engineering is all about leadership, but we don't see it that way and haven't for a very long time. It's just we have to champion it in days where there's a lot of pressure on the STEM side. It's important because the Air Force is a technical service. Life is technical now, so we need to have some cognizance of it. We can't be intimidated by the math or the science or the technology, the engineering. Although not all of us will become experts in the depth, but at least we're not intimidated by it, and we can work through it. But the deal is, if you're going to lead, and becoming a leader is part of the Wabash mission as well, leading effectively, you're leading humans. And if you're going to lead humans, you need to understand the human experience. And some of the greatest leaders, whether military or civilian, ever, have been poets, right? And historians and philosophers. They understand where we've been so that we can help people hopefully learn from mistakes, not repeat the bad history, but be resilient and recognize patterns and to have empathy with people. And empathy is an important point I want to emphasize today and come back to. And this is where there's so many parallels between Wabash and the Air Force Academy, or for West Point or Annapolis for that matter, because you're looking for something beyond the classroom experience, in this experience that you have with the gentleman's rule and with your mission of thinking critically and acting responsibly and leading effectively and living humanely. And sometimes it's counterintuitive when I bring up, this idea of living humanely when I'm in a business that manages violence, right? And so sometimes when I talk to people in higher ed, they can't get past the uniform, whether I have it on or not, or my experience in the military. But the military is a more complex enterprise, organism, than I think people kind of realize. We need to have leaders of character to operate in this space. And so this may sound really familiar to you. The development program for character and leadership at the Air Force Academy starts with living honorably, because the honor code, we will not lie, steal, cheat, nor tolerate anyone among us who does. It's pretty hard, but you could live by those words and still not really be a person of character, right? You could technically check off those things, and you're not necessarily a gentleman or a lady to make this work. So living honorably goes above it, which sounds really familiar to you guys. But that's personally, and then interpersonally, how do you lift others to be the best that they can possibly be? And then finally, at the organization level, as leadership, how do you elevate the performance of your organization that should have a purpose that feels noble and worthwhile? This is our shared purpose at the Air Force Academy. And one of the things I had to do when we came in is to make sure that we're all focused on that. So you get the vibe that you feel here of across the board, this is what your staff care about. They care about you. They want to have consistency across so that you have this shared purpose. But so should a service academy. The dean is not in competition with the commandant, who's the vice president for student affairs, right, is a commandant, brigadier general, and they do march to lunch. Okay, so I get that you're not going to march to lunch, and that's okay. The band can march, and that's good. But the thing is, we all got to do it together, and the athletic department, it can't be sanctuary in the athletic department. You can't say, well, you don't have to do that character thing in the athletic department. Oh, yeah, you do, because you're still leaders of character and you're student athletes. And that just should sound really familiar to you guys. So I think there's a lot of commonality with what we do. And the beauty of it is, I think the last thing that I'll focus on there is this sense of, to help you get there, people care about you. They're going to mentor you out of your comfort zone. They're going to ask you to do things that you just didn't foresee yourself ever doing. And if they really know you and really have this shared purpose, which I'm convinced your staff and faculty do, they're going to make you uncomfortable, and then you're going to grow, and you're going to say, hey, I can do this. I can do things I could never have imagined, and then keep that mindset for a lifetime. And that's a beautiful thing we share, and that happens at the Academy. I'll expand on that in a moment. So what I was going to do, and try to respect your time, is just say a little bit about myself. And you're tired of hearing my biography, so I'll keep it minimal. Joseph talked with me for the paper, and Richard talked with me for the podcast, and the faculty are probably tired of me already. So I'll be very brief about a little bit about me. I'll talk a little bit about leadership, and then I'll just leave something I hope that you can chew on and mull over. And I'll have the privilege to talk with Professor Bowen's class this afternoon a little bit more about a couple of things I'm going to hit on specifically, if that's okay. So let me just throw you back to the 1970s, which sounds like a really long time ago. It was actually a really long time ago. And what was going on? There were disco music and bell-bottom pants and a lot of civil rights activities that, for me in middle school and high school, I wasn't really that tuned into, honestly. And just think about back then, no internet, no smartphones. My window to the world in Spencer, Iowa, which had 11,000 people, it's really grown a lot. It's at 12,000 people now, I'm told, was the Spencer Public Library and books. And that was my window to the big, big world out there. Some of you have heard my anecdotes, and forgive me if you've heard them before, but yes, in fact, I was sort of a rural latchkey kid. So my dad had moved to town from farming, worked at a farm service store. So when I got home from school, I was kind of on my own with a dog out on farm buildings and fields. And so I kind of, I guess, ran amok. But I mostly ran down the road to the neighbor's pasture where there was this horse that no one seemed to ride. He had cockleburrs in his mane. He seemed kind of unkempt. And so it seemed to me that it was appropriate to lure him over the fence so I could get on him and stay on him as long as I could till he threw me off, which he invariably did. And I did this for days and weeks. And finally, I took such a tumble, I was really scraped up, and I couldn't hide it from Mom anymore. You know, when you're 9 and it's bath time, you can't really hide the big, giant, contusions and things. So I had to fess up at what I'd done, and they trotted me down the road, which is what people did then, and to make me apologize to the couple. And I did. I went to the door. I feel like I just did it this morning, and I can feel it again. I looked up at them. I said, "I'm very sorry for trespassing and stealing your horse." And this is the great part. So they looked at each other, and they worked in Chicago. We lived in Illinois there for a couple years before we went back to Iowa. They worked in Chicago and never were home during the day out in the suburbs. That's why I could sort of run around their property wantonly. And they looked at each other, and they looked at me, and they said, "You can ride Stormy?" I was like, "Stormy? That's his name?" Well, he was blind in one eye, and he threw everybody off, and so nobody associated with him. So here's a little life lesson I got. Take a chance. Hang tough. It's going to turn out okay. So, and so they said, "You can come anytime. You're free, right? It's a good deal." And then my dad bought me a little Morgan mare, and so I had 2 of them. It was like, this was a good deal. So I took a chance. But I also would climb up on roofs of things, and I had a German Shepherd, so I could only get up on the roof of the low barns, like the hog barn, for those of you familiar with. The city guys are going, "What are you talking about?" Well, it wasn't as stinky as you think, but up on the top, and I looked at you can see the curvature of the earth, not as many trees in Iowa as here, but big sky, little kid, little town, wondering, gosh, that's a big world out there. What will I ever do? Could I get out there? How would I be there? My mom and dad mortgaged everything for my brother to go to medical school at the University of Iowa, and that was about the only college experience our family had. So my sister and I were kind of on our own. And so when they had a career day at high school, the Air Force Academy liaison officer showed up, and I thought, wow, here's an opportunity. I can get a great education. I can play college basketball, and I can serve my country for a while. And I have to say, I admit, that wasn't the first thing. I didn't think of that our family didn't have a military tradition. I didn't know, and I didn't know what to think of it. And so I went to the Air Force Academy in 1977. So I was in the second co-ed class. So about 10% of the cadet wing were women. And honestly, most of the guys didn't want us there, and neither did the faculty. So this was a real shocking thing for an 18-year-old and for a white girl from Iowa to show up and become a minority and to be told, "We don't want you here, you're other, you're lowering standards." So I did what farm girls do, is I just did my best. Every day, put one foot in front of the other and tried to keep my head up and realized that for every 1 or 2 people who were horrible, there were 5 or 10 who were those wonderful mentors who just said, "Why don't you try this?" In fact, my air officer commanding, every cadet squadron had an officer over it. I happened to have an Army officer who'd been a prisoner of war in Vietnam. He'd been a Cobra helicopter pilot, shot down twice, and they captured him once. And he always downplayed it because he was only a POW for less than a year. It's like, okay, right. But he's a tough guy, but he was a great leader. And he saw me in the hallway one day, and this is a mentor who knew me in ways I didn't realize he knew me. And he said, "Cadet Johnson, I've seen you play basketball. You were a warrior." See, he didn't say I was fast or graceful. He said, "You were a warrior." I got to the loose balls fastest. But he said, in the Air Force, the warriors fly. Why aren't you in the flying program? And I said, well, I have to wear glasses, and my dad was a farmer. What do I know? And so I went and I flew. And so I wound up actually flying actively for 20 years, and amazing experience of leadership and of the mission that we had. But I also had teachers who said, why don't you compete for a Rhodes Scholarship? And I said, well, I'm just a gal from Iowa, I couldn't do that. And they urged me and goaded me, and we took a chance, and it hung tough, and it worked out. So maybe you can relate to that a little bit of seeing things that you could never have imagined. And so that's why the title of the talk is, be open to what can be. We get a little hung up on what is or what has been. And it's really hard sometimes, and it doesn't matter how old you are, all of us in organizations, to kind of get past, well, this is how it's worked, and so that's how it should always be. And it's like, well, could, or wow, what could be if you took another inclusive view of another way of looking at something, or adjusted to what's happening in the world, and just try to be flexible in your thinking. And imagine this, think critically, act responsibly, lead effectively, right? Live humanely in anything you do. So what a great experience I really had. And that feeling of being other has been actually useful, because it happens over and again. And what the lesson I took away was, I don't want anybody to have to feel that way. And when you can think about, I'm still a little mad about how it went. Even when I was on faculty in the 90s, a little bit of it happened. It's like, you gotta be kidding me. But then I learned along the way, there are other aspects of this. It's not just about gender. It's not just about skin color or religion. Sometimes it's professional diversity. Like, I'd show up in some of the eclectic things I've done in the Air Force to lead, and people would say, well, you haven't done what I've done for 20 years, so how could you possibly add value? And I could say, well, I know you have the depth and the expertise, but man, if we connected you to you, we could really have something. What can be? And to sort of get over the professional diversity. I mean, I see it now because people say, you're in the military. And it's like, well, yeah, but we need Army privates, but I'm not the same as them. I'm not the same as a sailor. We need all of us to make this all work. So the military is not a monolithic, homogeneous place. It's pretty American. It's pretty worldly. It's pretty global. I've spent my adult life with an incredibly diverse set of friends and colleagues, and who I completely have trusted my life with. And that's the world you're going to go lead in. So this is a pretty exciting opportunity to be able to share this with you. By the way, with respect to the all-male part, I don't have this idea that everything needs to be co-ed. In fact, my husband went to Virginia Military Institute when it was all male, and we met 30 years ago. We married 27 years ago. He got a good deal. He's only had to live with me for 20 of them because we were lived apart so much from assignment. So get that in the fine print sometime. But so it came to the attention of Nightline, ABC Nightline, that there was an Air Force Academy graduate woman married to a VMI graduate man, and what would my opinions be about this all-male school at VMI? And I said, well, and the producers always talk to you, and I've told some of you guys this, so sorry to repeat for you, but producers talk to you before you're on TV or radio to see what you're really gonna say, because they have to plan the show. And they asked me my opinion, and I said, well, I think there's room, right, for all women, all male schools. The trick comes if it's state funding or federal funding, and parents are giving tax dollars. Kind of hard to justify that only the boys can go, not the girls. I think that's where it gets tricky with the funding, but in terms of the principles, the benefits of all women's schools, all men's schools, co-ed schools, I think you could discuss that and sort that out. So this is great, and I wish they had written this down, because they basically said, well, you're too reasonable, and we don't want you on the show, because they wanted to fight. And if they had written it down, that would be so handy. There are times I need evidence that endorses I'm reasonable. But that didn't happen, so I didn't get that. So the thing is, let me just say, this whole Oxford experience really opened my mind. So the arc of my life changed. I'm at Oxford studying. And while I was there, it's the Cold War, okay? 81 through 83. The Cold War is pretty hot then. The Falkland Islands effects were going on for the Brits. Margaret Thatcher was prime minister. The people weren't wild about a conservative prime minister, let alone her gender. It was really, got a first from Oxford, by the way, but she did it in chemistry because they didn't let women do political science, but she became the Prime Minister of England. So a lot of things changed in the 70s. Parliament changed Cecil Rhodes' will in the 70s so that women could be Rhodes Scholars. I didn't know. I didn't know that President Ford had signed legislation in 1975 that changed the role of women in the services so they could go to service academies and go to pilot training. Who knew? But it's a big, big deal. Before that legislation, women could not have families if they were in the Air Force. If you married a guy with kids, you got out because you had kids now. It was not a welcoming place. I mean, a lot of stuff changed in the 70s that I figured out after the fact, right, as I was plowing through. But same in England and at Oxford. And here's the other thing. I'm an Air Force Academy graduate at Oxford during the Cold War, and the British are saying, you Americans, you can't beat monolithic communism. What are you trying to do? And they really challenged my patriotism in the sense of who I was. So I really have to take stock and say, what is my patriotism? We're not perfect. Our country hasn't got everything exactly right. But I'm still so proud that I was born where I was when I was, and proud of the flag I defend. But I really had to reason through my beliefs, my patriotism. And so I didn't know this at the time, but I found this piece that really summed up the outlook that I started to develop there. And this is a piece by Judge Learned Hand, who served as a federal judge from 1909 to 1951. He was nicknamed the 10th Justice of the Supreme Court for his many influential decisions. He became known as the defender of free speech and liberty in his more than 2,000 opinions. And he gave this address in 1944, in May of 1944. So World War II is not over yet. And, and I'll allude later, we talk about, well, that was a time of war. We're living in a time of war right now. And we were then as well. But here's what he said. And what is this liberty which must lie in the hearts of men and women? It is not the ruthless, the unbridled will. It is not freedom to do as one likes. That is the denial of liberty and leads straight to its overthrow. A society in which men recognize no check upon their freedom soon becomes a society where freedom is the possession of only a savage few, as we have learned to our sorrow. What then is the spirit of liberty? I cannot define it. I can only tell you my own faith. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which is not too sure that it is right. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which seeks to understand the minds of other men and women. The spirit of liberty is the spirit which weighs their interests alongside its own without bias. The spirit of liberty remembers that not even a sparrow falls to earth unheeded. I think that's what I was trying to get at when I was at graduate school in England, to think about what I stand for. And it's such an opening up experience to be there. And by the way, congratulations, Wabash, for your 9 Rhodes Scholars that you've had. I read up about Jacob Burnett. Some of you know Jacob probably. And one of the things that stood out to me about him is something Miss Albrecht said in a newspaper article about him, because I was trying to do my homework a little bit before I came. And she talked about his empathy, and in addition to his intellectual ability and his energy and his leadership, but his empathy being one of his foremost characteristics. And so I hope you picked up from what I said from Learned Hand, the humility and the empathy he talked about, and knowing Jacob exemplifies that in your brand. He's your brand, you're the brand, you're that. Knowing what is, but being open to what can be. So that's a little bit about me. Let me talk a little bit about leadership. And this is what's kind of stunning for me and when I talk with people about leadership. And a Marine Lieutenant General and I are really good friends, and he's getting ready to retire as well. We served together. My husband served in Okinawa for 3 years as an Air Force liaison to the Marines, so he talks in guttural sounds as well. But I was talking to my friend, John Whistler, and he said, the same thing. When you say to people, we'd like to consult in leadership or we'd like to lead, people say, well, you don't really do leadership in service, right? You just order them around and tell them to go march over there. It's like, wow, that would be awesome if it worked that way. But it doesn't work that way. And it makes me wonder about the civil-military gap in our country. I mean, less than 1% of Americans ever serve in uniform. It's been an all-volunteer force for 44 years. And there was something about a draft, as inequitably as sometimes it was executed, as harrowing as it was in Vietnam, at least it gave every American citizen kind of a stake in the game. And now there's a small kind of group, a couple of million people out of 310 million people who do this, and I hope we don't get too disconnected. But I don't think we understand each other as well as we do. And there's so many things we do are the same. We just have to translate. We have different words. We have different dynamics. The stakes are a little different in what we do. But the modern profession of arms is not the 18th century profession of arms. We don't march into battle. Now, I always thank our cadets after big ceremonies and parades, because I go, look, you're not going to march into battle. But if you're able to use the teamwork, attention to detail, and care to march together, it's good for you to work teamwork, but it also shows other people. If they can do that, they can probably fly a satellite and a plane, and the other stuff's probably okay, because they don't see you doing that. They only see you marching around. But the marching is not what it's about, and hasn't been for centuries, really. Leadership requires these different situations. So let me give you a couple examples. So when I left the faculty at the Air Force Academy, I went and I became Air Force aide to the president, for President Bush 41, and that means I carried the emergency satchel, this football. And so there's one officer from each service, a major or a lieutenant colonel, who's the emergency actions officer. So the football, and they have you at that age because there's a lot of schlepping around. You have to carry bags and run around a lot, so they don't have older people do it. So while you still have legs, they have you out there working it. And it was a privilege because I was there for a transition of administrations, right, from President Bush to President Clinton. So an amazing thing for an American to be part of and to see how that works. But I didn't have any formal authority over anybody. And yet, ultimately, what I needed to do is have earned the respect of the Secret Service and every senior person in the White House. So if a really bad thing happened, and ICBMs take about 30 minutes from Eurasia. But if they have intermediate range missiles from off the coast of the United States, it might be a couple minutes. And so the goal is that earn enough trust to be able to, at any moment, if you have to, walk in and say, Mr. President, come with me. To save the presidency, to connect the president to the National Command Authority through connectivity, whether you put him on a helicopter to get him out of there, or after 9/11 with President Bush 43, when people said, why is he flying around in Louisiana and Nebraska? Oh, they did exactly what they're supposed to do. Get him away from whatever the unknown, terrible thing is so that he can be the commander-in-chief and be in connectivity. There's no button in there, but they are in connectivity. So you had to earn people's trust, right? And I didn't have any official authority, so you have to gain it by persuasion and trust and influence and understanding what you do. Now, fortunately, right, that doesn't happen for the most part. So you do other things. You're ceremonial aid, right? So you troop the line or go with the presidential, the awards ceremonies and things, or screen calls at Camp David, because you're on Air Force One, Marine One, you're wherever the president is. One of us had to be on his hip, 5 people doing one job to make sure there's always continuity for the presidency. The Secret Service is there to protect the person of the president. So they're going to put him in a safe room or put something else, and then the next step is to say, okay, now let's take him here. Or this is the nearest hospital if the terrible thing happens. Or, Vice President, you're up, because you say the code that says the president's down. And that's the 25th Amendment, which is most of the emergency thing. The 25th Amendment came in after President Kennedy was assassinated, and they realized the Constitution really never had the whole succession thing worked out that great. And the chain of custody was all messed up on President Kennedy's body and the bullets and all that stuff. So pretty gory stuff, pretty grim. But you had to be ready just in case, right? So even though in the movie Air Force One that had that silly escape pod at the back, that's not right. The Glenn Close got the 25th Amendment stuff about right. So that's what we kind of had to do. But I bring this up for leadership because there was no ordering anybody around. I had to persuade people far senior to me, political appointees, to do what I needed them to do without really having authority over it. And eventually they figured out, if I didn't, but by that time I'd already moved on, so we're all good. But so when I transitioned from that scenario back to an Air Force base to go fly again, on about day 3, one of the sergeants said, ma'am, you could just tell us what to do. You don't have to persuade us. And I said, well, I don't want to ever lose that entirely, because Leadership should be about people understanding the meaning of what you're trying to do. Now, in the heat of battle, obviously, there's not time to chat, and there's not a lot of time for sugar, But afterwards, there is, but also this shared purpose. But so leadership is flexible, and it needs to be inclusive, and understanding the shared purpose and how you articulate that to people senior to you or junior to you. And the trick is some of it's more about moral courage than physical courage. So there was this retired Army Lieutenant General at the White House, head of the White House military office when I was there when they were hiring me, because in the bow wave of history, I was the first woman to do the thing for DOD. Because of the timing, I just happened to be there. And they wanted to make sure I was thinking about this. And he'd fought in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, so he knew something. He also was a retired three-star, looked a lot older than I think three-stars look now. Anyway, but he said, look, physical courage, and if you talk to a Medal of Honor winner, they're invariably this way. They never take credit. They always say, I didn't think, I just acted. I acted on adrenaline and training. And when you're flying a plane and something's on fire, you don't have time. Your body realizes something's on fire. And deep down inside, this is a bad thing, and I don't want it to die. But you don't have time to be distracted by that. You have to compartmentalize, and just by training you, I'm going to do this and this and this, and then later I'll have the adrenaline hit, and it'll be okay. But he said moral courage is harder, right? In the cold light of day, you got to look at somebody and say, you're still one of God's children, but you're not hacking it. And this won't stand, and you've got to do something different. That is hard. That is hard to do, but that's going to be more and more of a premium in the modern profession of arms, I think. And to do that without being so rigid and without losing your sense of openness, I think you have to be clear on who you are and what you stand for. And so another person that I've discovered later, reading about, was Viktor Frankl, who was a survivor of concentration camps, a psychologist, and he could have gotten out of Germany before the Nazis got him, but he stayed because a lot of his family were in the camps, and he stayed. And he wrote about man's search for meaning, mankind, I think is what he meant on that one for all of us. But if I paraphrase him right, he talked about saying, the meaning of life comes from doing something you love with people you love. And then when you're faced with adversity, having the attitude to overcome the adversity and turn your predicament into an achievement. Because success is not the absence of failure. And I think that's something hard for us to say in American society. We say it about inventions. We go, yes, we should go out to the design center at Stanford and fail fast and come up with new things, which is true. And yet somehow it's really hard to say, well, I think I just messed that up. I think I just failed. What do I learn from it? Entrepreneurs snap, right? They lose everything, right? And they start over again. How do the rest of us keep that kind of courage? Or the kind of courage that takes truth to power, to say, no, sir, that won't work. Someone's going to get hurt if we do that. We need to do something else. That takes a lot of moral courage, and it was something I've had to think about a lot. So again, I've just left being the superintendent of the Air Force Academy, and I loved doing that. I love the people I did it with, and I miss them horribly. I'm in grieving a bit. I'm about the 6th stage of grief over the thing, but I've got to overcome that, right, and have the right attitude to go forth and for me to be open to what can be, and that's what's exciting. And the charter I'd gotten when I became the superintendent was from the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and he said, how do you take this traditional mission and deliver it in a way that's relevant to this generation and to the modern profession of arms? And I think we made progress doing that because we opened up our aperture on how to deliver the traditional mission in modern ways. And let me just explain what I mean about the modern profession of arms. Yes, the Air Force has airplanes, and the Army has tanks, and the Navy has ships. But it's more than that. What was sort of platform-centric. The airplane, the tank, the ship. We're way beyond that now. We're in air, space, and cyberspace. So in that domain, you need what you're getting at Wabash. It doesn't mean you're going to go serve in the military or the Defense Department, but modern problems match this, parallel this. Critical thinking, problem solving, collaboration, inclusiveness, and creativity. Imagining what can be. And that takes moral courage. And what we're trying to wrestle with right now in the modern profession of arms is, what's the nature of valor? And people struggle. A couple of years ago, a lot of veterans protested the idea of giving medals to people who are remotely piloted aircraft operators, drone pilots. because they said that's not valor. Well, it's easy to portray in a movie or in a story the lone hero, American sniper, which, with all due respect, amazing American. But that's really not the whole story. It's much more complex than that. The modern profession of arms is a team sport. It's networked. When there's a strike in Afghanistan, it might have been started by somebody in Nevada or South Dakota on a screen who's been watching the pattern of life of an IED factory worker in Afghanistan for days and weeks and months. And then they're controlling the platform in Afghanistan via satellites flown from someone at another base, because we fly satellites, you move them around. They might bounce off a Dutch fighter plane off of an American drone to help support ground forces from everywhere in the coalition. And then they keep watching and see the carnage afterwards to understand the battle damage. They're visually close, even though they might not be standing there. And people are getting PTSD from that, because then what do? They go home and take the kids to soccer. What does that do to your head? And we're trying to understand psychologically what that's doing to people's head. Is that not valor? Is that not a warrior? It's a different kind of warrior, and it's hard to sort it out. It's just a different profession of arms. These F-35s and F-22s that cost so much aren't about the Red Baron and dogfighting. My goodness, if they're getting caught in a dogfight, it is a bad day. That's sort of pilot gallows humor for, that wing just went off. And I don't have a checklist for that. There are nodes in networks. If they do their work, they do their work, and the other guys don't even know they were there. That's the point of them. But it's hard for us to let go of this idea of the silk scarf and the fighter plane. But that's not how it all works. And the challenge for people watching this is we actually have codes of conduct. We are, the Americans and our coalition partners care about life. We do care about the rules of the laws of war and try to be humane, even though we're managing violence. And I know it's an awful thing to say, but we really do have standards, and people really do care. And I'm going to talk to Professor Bowen's class a little bit more about this later, but just think about this. I'll give you one of the examples of a lieutenant who watched an IED factory guy. Every day he'd come out of his house and put one of his kids on the back of the motorbike when he went to work, because he knew the Americans wouldn't shoot him. And finally, the Army, one of the leaders, and it wasn't a direct verbal order, it's a different world. They're trying to figure out what's the best time to take him out. And finally, they said, this has been months, let's just take him out. And the lieutenant said, no, I can't do that. And he was honored. He wasn't punished. They said, I understand, let's look at this again. The guy happened to stay in his house for 4 days, and when he came out, he did not put a kid on the back, and they took him out. It's still violent, it's still a tragedy, a human life was taken, and I don't take that lightly. But that's a young person 2 or 3 years out of college making that decision and speaking truth to power. I think that's what we want in an American service member. But look, think of the pressure and the psychology of that. That's the modern profession of arms. Let me take an easy one. Here's an easier one that you may not think we think about. So in the Mountain West Conference, we started talking about the take a knee thing. And during the national anthem, if athletes or people in the crowd want to take a knee. And of course, I've taken an oath to the Constitution. I will never disrespect the flag. That's not my oath. But guess what? I defend the Constitution that gives people the right to do that. I defend your right to do that. So we said, this is easy for us. We'll put our hand on our heart. We'll sing the national, I won't sing it because I'm a terrible singer and I wouldn't subject you to that. But what we worried about was, our opponent or the crowd can do, but we don't need some grumpy alumnus taking umbrage, right, and saying, you can't do that at my place, we're gonna slug them. So we talked to our law enforcement folks and said, let's think about how we can have people be free to express, but be safe, and not have someone become violent out of well-intentions, but just, it's not right. So we worked our way through that, but I wanted you to know that's how we think, and that may not be what you think that people in uniform think about. But we do take very seriously that our oath is to the Constitution, not to any one person or party. And I think that's part of the greatness of our country. So I've talked a little bit about myself and a little bit about leadership. Let me leave you with something else. I'm watching your time before you get hungry. You're getting hungry, aren't you? So let me give you something to think about. Please consider, again, what I said about my consideration of my patriotism at Oxford, or what I just said about the Constitution, I've been out of my comfort zone a lot, and I was at Oxford. And I had to reflect on what I stand for, but as Judge Hand said, not to be too sure that I'm so right, and to seek that and to understand the minds of other men and women. So I think Kim King's chapel talk last spring touched on this a bit as well, and he used the novel To Kill a Mockingbird to help illustrate his message about taking pause points, to step back and consider the structures that shape our thinking and our communications, to think critically. The British would say, take 5 paces back from the chart. What are we trying to do again? What's happening here? Or that there's a lame saying, when you're up to your neck in alligators, it's difficult to remember the primary objective is to drain the swamp, right? It's like, well, what are we trying to do again? So I think he was brilliant in the way he laid that out. Now, Winston Churchill was not a Wabash grad, as far as I know. Could have been. But he was fairly accomplished in his own right. And he made a statement on Remembrance Day in November of 1947, which was 2 months after the U.S. Air Force became an independent service. The RAF was an independent service in 1919. The United States Air Force wasn't separate from the Army Air Corps until 1947. So this is all very fresh after the war and very fresh in our nation. And here's what Winston Churchill said. Many forms of government have been tried, and you may have heard this before, and will be tried in this world of sin and woe. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. And I think that's a fair way to look at it. So I've quoted Judge Learned Hand and Prime Minister Churchill from the end of World War II. And though that's over 70 years ago, it was a time of conflict and uncertainty in the world, which we feel now, I think. In the 90s, at the end of the Cold War, and 47 was the beginning of the Cold War, the 90s were the end of the Cold War, Francis Fukuyama posited that we've reached the end of history, that liberal democracy had triumphed. And we've had to revisit that, obviously. Others proposed different hypotheses for the post-Cold War world. For example, John Lewis Gaddis described a new balance of power between the forces of integration and those of fragmentation. Integration in terms of communications and economic interdependence, and fragmentation in terms of nationalism and protectionism. And so I don't intend to formally unpack those theses, but I bring up the historical references to provide context for the challenges that Wabash men and all of us face today. Challenges for which the Wabash faculty and staff are providing you tools to tackle and resolve these challenges. You love it when we give you all the pressure. But be sure, there are U.S. forces at war in Syria, in Afghanistan, and Iraq. 4 United States Air Force Academy graduates who flew A-10s over the Arizona Bowl football game for us last December were flying missions over Syria the next week. The Korean Peninsula and South Pacific, as you know, are a tinderbox with a nuclear stake in it. In Europe, Allied forces and NATO are at high readiness levels conducting coalition exercises to assist and boost the confidence of Eastern European nations in holding the line against Russian ambitions. In space, state actors are developing and testing anti-satellite weapons. What's at stake? It's more than your smartphone for GPS, satellites. It's about navigation and precision of navigation in airline routes so that people don't run into each other. It's the timing signals for gasoline pumps. If this GPS goes down, you can't put your card in, you can't get gas. The ATM timing. Things go through GPS, I think you might not realize, and the Air Force was pretty short-sighted. If they had figured out a way to get a couple of dollars every time your OnStar hits the satellite, we'd be good for funding for a long time. But in cyberspace as well, data is not the only thing at risk, right? My medical records and personnel records have been exfiltrated by state actors like 3 times, so I need to probably call another country to figure out what my doctor's appointment will be. But people are in our systems, right? The banking system. is at risk. It's under assault every day by state and non-state actors. The infrastructure, like electrical grids and dams, are under constant assault by non-state and state actors. So the world faces conflict and uncertainty again, in many ways as we have before. But the new twist I'd submit to you, and this is what I'll leave you with, is a variation on Gaddis's notion of fragmentation. The forces of globalization versus the identity politics that we have today, or this focusing on identity. Consider this: social media has changed our behavior. It feeds us what we like, or what we liked before, or what we bought before. So I'd put to you is, how does that opening our minds? Is that closing our minds? It changes our behavior. Last night, President Hess and I were walking off campus, and some Pokemon Go people came on base. What? It's changed our behavior. And it's something for you to think about. If our minds are closing and we shut down personal relationships and respectful connections and even our empathy for others, how can we go forward and solve these problems? How does a leader of character live honorably and lift others in an anonymous online environment? How does a gentleman interact on Yik Yak, on Yodel, or other of those lovely anonymous chat rooms? What do you stand for? Living humanely, exercising moral courage, remembering that you are not alone and no one else is alone and shouldn't be made to feel that way. And here's where your liberal arts education can help turn our predicaments into our achievements. Mark Zuckerberg, obviously the founder and CEO of Facebook, said, and I paraphrase, there's a psychology and a sociology with the technology. Who's more perfectly equipped to address those kinds of challenges that attend technology than people with this rich, deep liberal arts education that you have? So I wish you well. I thank you for thinking critically and acting responsibly and leading effectively and living humanely. And I hope my remarks, at least to some extent, have run across disciplines and given you some things to consider. I need to thank you again for your warm hospitality, for making me feel part of the wonderful community. And it's been a wonderful privilege to be here. But one more thing before I go. Bring home that Monon bell.